Hello everyone. So today's lecture is going to link from the lecture that I did last time, which was on Marx and the concept of ideology, and we looked at Louis Althusser and his concept of the ideological state apparatus. Now, that's a really weird place to start when you're linking on to a lecture about Foucault, because Foucault was vocally very anti-Marxist. I think he made a comment saying that it belongs to the 19th century as opposed to the 20th century, and this was partly linked to the same reasons that Althusser called himself a neo-Marxist, that what had come out in the latter part of the 20th century, or after Khrushchev's secret speeches about the atrocity of Stalinism and the cult of personality that had formed around him. Many Western Marxists wanted to distance themselves from that and moved either to the New Left in some cases, which started to develop around this period. Others moved towards anarchism or libertarian forms of socialism, and others shifted towards the Chinese Democratic Republic as an alternative model until obviously Mao was also disgraced. But another group tends to produce itself during this period, and this group, even though they themselves never referred to themselves as this, they were often referred to as the post-structuralists. I'm not going to go into a discussion about post-structuralism here. I have done a blog post before which I think briefly overviews what post-structuralism and structuralism are, and you can also find that on my MSc thesis, which is also located on this site. But for today, I just want to focus on Michel Foucault, one of my favorite historians and philosophers, and we're going to build up over the next couple of episodes or whatever you want to call these to his, what I consider his best book, which is Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prism. So in this first part, we're just going to be talking about Michel Foucault, his role as a historian and his historical method. We're also going to talk a little bit about his book Madness and Civilisation, because that gives us a good idea of what he's doing or what his historical method is. And then we're going to move on, and we're going to, in the next section, we will take a look at the birth of the prism. So for today, we're just going to focus on an introduction to Foucault and give us the grounding so we can understand what is going on in Discipline and Punish. So, but just a quick briefer just before we get on to that one. So first of all, I want to talk about this concept of historical interpretation, because even though Foucault is considered somewhat of a sociologist or philosopher, he's actually by discipline a historian, and he considers himself a historian in this sense. So we need to have a look at this concept of historical interpretation, because many people, when they start studying history, particularly in England, they start studying history and they assume when it comes to history, we already know everything we need to know, that there are historical facts which dictate how we understand our history and how we understand the world. But actually, history is not really about the memorization of facts, because if all history was proven, if we knew exactly what was going on, then all these people that are getting paid in universities to study history are essentially wasting their time, or essentially being paid to do nothing. I mean, what do we think historians would do if all history had been proven true, or we understand our history in totality? So this links us to the discipline of history and what it means to be a historian. And it all reflects around this concept of historical interpretation. So history is not about the memorization of facts, is the first thing that we need to bear in mind. So you always get that kind of boring teacher when you are studying GCSE or when you were at school, where they'll say, turn to page 35, we must remember the dates, we must facts and figures, this is what history is all about. We want to move away from that kind of history, because even though those things are important in history, that is not what history is necessarily all about. It's not a memorizing kind of subject. It's about debating the incidents that happen and then what caused these incidents to happen. So this links me on to my next point, that historical interpretation is about assessing why things happen. So we know, as a kind of historical fact, is kind of that very how you would probably study history at school, the memorization of dates. We know for a fact that the Second World War did happen. There was an international war. But what we're interested in as a historian is why the Second World War took place, why this war happened, what were the reasons, what were the factors as to how that became an international event and ended up being the way it was. So for many historians, some would prioritize the economy, for example. They would say that economics was the main reason that led to the war. Others would say it was ideology. Others would say it was political. Others would say it was social. And historians kind of debate and argue their point around these factors. So the result of this is that over different periods, there are changing or constantly changing interpretations of our history. And history is quite important for building our own social identities, because people need an understanding of their past to know who they are so they can move forward in the future. So history is an extremely powerful tool, which is why in the changing education specs, changing GCSE specs, there is a huge focus on what you are learning in history and how that helps you build your own identity. And that's why the focus on Britishness from conservative leaning politicians and teachers and people within the education sector want you to do a module in England that is on British history, because it allows you to shape your identity and how you construct yourself from that. But it doesn't just relate to kind of how it's taught in education. History also is a constantly changing field, because in different time periods or at different times, there are dominant understandings of the historical events that have happened, or dominant interpretations which undermine others. So if we think about, for example, the First World War, when the First World War first happened, historians would generally attribute that to the fault of Germany. But as we develop First World War historiography, the picture starts to become more complicated. So you end up with competing interpretations as to what historians consider to be the main reasons for the build-up to the First World War. So history is constantly changing, constantly fluctuating. And so it's important to recognize that it's quite a loose discipline. It's not exactly set in stone, and it's based around how well you can argue your interpretation of why events have happened. So this links me on to very nicely to another philosopher that we've looked at lately, and we're going to look at him again in this series on Foucault. But I think this quote really sums up this study of history quite well, particularly modern history and even any kind of study of the past. So Nietzsche says, against that positivism which stops before phenomena, saying there are only facts, I should say no. It is precisely facts that do not exist, only interpretations. Okay, so things are based on interpretations. Our social reality, our social understanding of history is based on interpretations, other people's interpretations, which then shape how we understand our history. And this is constantly changing and fluctuating as a result. So what we're going to look at today, or over these next few lessons that I want to talk through, we're going to have an overview of Foucault's life, which is what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the development of Foucault's historical method, which we're also going to look at today, and then we're going to take a look at the birth of the prison, which is the end point that I really want to get onto. So let's start with Foucault's life and intellectual development. Now, it's a bit controversial talking about Foucault's life, because he was someone who didn't like people to talk about the authors. He believed in this concept that Roland Barthes came up with, which is the death of the author. So in traditional literature review and literature criticism, people would look to the author of a text and say, what did you mean by that? What did you mean when you said this? Why did you say that? And what Foucault argues is we should not look towards the author to give us meaning of the text. Because if we do that, essentially it might ruin your interpretation or your kind of understanding of that text. And two, it gives the author some sort of authority over the work and how you interpret their work, as opposed to language being more loose, which links to Jacques Derrida and these ideas of language being an unstable construct, that the words we use and the language we use is constantly unstable. So just bearing that in mind, Foucault probably wouldn't have appreciated people talking about his life, but there have been some biographies and autobiographies relating to Foucault. So he says at the start of his book, Archaeology of Knowledge, do not ask me who I am, and do not ask me to remain the same. Leave it to our bureaucrats and our police to see that our papers are in order. At least spare us their morality when we write. So he doesn't want to be identified. He doesn't want to be defined by one particular thing. We should always bear that in mind when we're looking at his life and his work indeed, because he tends to fluctuate or change throughout his books and his writings. So we'll start with his early life. So Foucault was born in Poitiers, France in 1926. He was the father. His father was called Paul Foucault, who was a respectable doctor, and it was very much believed that Michel, or the young Michel, would follow in his father's footsteps and take up medicine and move into the industries of either medicine or a practicing doctor or something like that. He was also raised Roman Catholic, so that could be considered as somewhat oppressive in terms of sexual relations, which becomes one of the fixations of his later work, looking at the history of sexuality and sexual politics. So we can see that as being a potential influence too. And in 1946, he managed to get a place at the ENS, which is an extremely prestigious university in France, which was set up after the French Revolution, which would dedicate, it would produce countless academics throughout the period. But whilst he studied there, Foucault was a largely unpopular individual. He struggled to make friends. He struggled to get on with people. In one case, he even chased a classmate with a dagger who was potentially teasing him. He was kind of like that kid at school who listens to extreme heavy metal music, has black hair, and doesn't really talk to anyone. He was that particular person, and I think he felt ostracized by the experiences he was having at that school. And as a result, he ended up being prone to self-harming, where his father had him sent to a psychiatrist in order to see what his problems were, why he was behaving in this way, and to try and give him some sort of social stability in his life. So this then leads Foucault to get involved in art, and he used to decorate his room, or so it goes. He used to decorate his room with paintings by Goya, who was a particularly aggressive and violent artist, as we can see from this image that we put on the board. Goya's paintings had originated from the horrors of the war, and so he would represent his kind of feelings in this way. But we can see it's kind of dark imagery, which he would use on his walls to kind of paint his life. Got another Goya painting here where it looks like we've got some sort of satanic figure which is looking over the congregation of people. And you can see that has been a little bit weird. It's like when you walk into someone's dorm room and they've maybe got some kind of freaky post-Satanist images or literature. Another example here, so we've got like a dead turkey and an obsession with death that is riding over Goya's work. And then we also have more death. So we've got like headless individuals, headless men, people being chopped up. I'm not sure of the particular images that he would have had on his wall, but this gives you a taste of Goya's images and the kind of things that he would use. So we could say that if we were in a modern context, Foucault would be considered, or what we would consider now, a modern day goth, where no doubt if he was in a kind of later time period, such as the 1980s, he would have been listening to Sisters of Mercy, putting eyeliner on, dressing in black, and having his big Doc Martin boots, listening to kind of synthwave or synth music. So it's a good way to think of him in this period outside of his depression. But it turns out once his father had taken him to the psychiatrist said that Foucault, all these behaviors that Foucault was expliciting was merely acting out his repression of his homosexuality or his homosexual tendencies. And so that kind of clicked in Foucault, because at the time homosexuality was very taboo. It wasn't really accepted in France. And so what he was doing is he was trying to hide it by acting out in this particular way. So this leads him to kind of accept his sexual identity as he grows older, and ends up spending a lot of time in men's bathhouses as a result, which people think ends up causing his death. So let's go to his actual intellectual development. So Foucault hadn't been, I mean, he says that when he was at school, the only reason he became intelligent, because he wasn't naturally intelligent when he was at school, was by doing the homework for other boys that he had fancied. But he didn't really find any particular passion. And as I say, it was expected that he fell into some sort of medical profession as his father had pushed him into. But he discovers a love of history, and particularly kind of philosophical history, when he discovers Friedrich Nietzsche whilst holidaying with one of his lovers in 1953. And the text that captures Foucault is Nietzsche's essay called On the Uses and Abuses of History for Life. And what Nietzsche argues in this piece is that historians tend to discuss history in a very disinterested way, almost as if these great things have happened in the past and they will never happen again. You could never aspire to the great events that have already happened, so don't even try it. Or they tend to, it's kind of like what we were talking about at the start, those kind of teachers or experiences you might have had at school where they stand at the front and they say, and in 1945, the war ended, and then after that there was peace. This kind of history, in a very disinterested way, Nietzsche argues, was killing the concept or the idea or understanding of history and what history should be. Nietzsche also argues in this essay that there is too much focus on great individuals, that in the past there were these super great, fantastic, almost mythical, legendary individuals that will never appear again. They were so great, we will never get an experience of them again. And he also argues that modern life or individuals will never be as great as what has passed, that the history that we are constantly engaging with approaches us in this sense, that the times that we're living in, the experiences we are having, will never be as great as what has been, which is why history, and I actually agree with Nietzsche here, that I think history is quite a conservative, or can be quite a conservative subject, because of this idea that all the great things have already happened. There are these great individuals of the past, and it's very unlikely they will come back again. But I think, as they also say as well, you have to wait till you die until people maybe appreciate your greatness. And we see that with various other prime ministers, that their statues are only erected, not usually in their own lifetime, but after. So Foucault is inspired by this essay by Nietzsche, and he decides, or comes up with a new version of history kind of inspired by this. He said that we should look back to the past to look at issues in our own time, that history can be a toolbox to actually diagnose what we are experiencing today, or at least look for kind of similarities and differences, and to actually follow some sort of trajectory to see how we got in this situation or the problems we're experiencing in the modern world. And coming off of this, Foucault actually uses a concept in his work called an episteme, which is a really key concept for understanding Foucault's understanding of social reality and history. So for Foucault, we have to understand that reality is chaotic, that the world around us doesn't actually make much sense. To give you another example of this using Nietzsche, one of the things Nietzsche comes up with in his later writings is that the only way we can understand the world is through the language we use. So by being able to describe something as a chair means that I know what a chair is and I can ascribe its characteristics. But there are certain things, words in other languages that don't translate to English, such as the German word Zeitgeist. There are also other words that are other things that exist in the world that we don't have words for, that we struggle to identify and codify. And so therefore we cannot necessarily understand how chaotic the entire world is. We use things like language and events and disciplines such as history, politics, sociology to try and structure and understand the world, when in reality the whole world is chaotic. Things don't make sense and they don't link as easily together as these various disciplines like to try and make out. So based off this, he comes up with the idea that in order to understand historical periods, different historical periods have ways of defining and understanding the world. So for example, at the end of the 19th century, there is a really popular scientific discovery in eugenics, which is based off Darwinism, which develops into social Darwinism, which gives us an idea, which links to the Third Reich, which develops the idea that some humans are better than others and that we live in a situation of survival of the fittest, that those scientific discourses or discourses that are popular in modern science dictate how we understand the world. Similarly, if we think of today, there are dominant discourses today which dictate how we view the world and the way that we live our lives. So for example, there's a popular liberal discourse about recycling and green energy, for example. So you need to make sure you put your Coke cans on the side and you put them in the right bin and you recycle, even though in reality, once you've done that, they then ship it off to China. It ends up being burnt elsewhere because we have nowhere else to put it. But anyway, it dictates that understanding, that scientific discovery, or those popular discourses dictate how we interact and understand the period we are living in. And Foucault then argues that these dominant definitions or these dominant understandings of our period benefit particular groups and undermine others. So this is where power comes into it, that as a result, whoever manages to control these discourses, or whoever manages to set these discourses, so that could be universities, that could be researchers, it could be politicians, it could be the courts, it could be various other institutions, whoever can set these discourses and make them popular has the dominant power in that particular period. So power becomes a key focus of Foucault's work, based on this concept of an episteme, which is the ordering of reality in a historical period, or how a historical period orders or understands its reality through language and physical practices. Yeah, it's quite a complex term, but it's a really useful one for understanding it. And I tend to get criticized by my colleagues for being a political animal when it comes to history. But actually what I'm talking about is this. And frequently I'll say people are essentially blank slates that you can create and recreate. And this idea links to that. And we'll look at it in more detail when we move to the history of the prism. So based on what we've seen, and this historical method that Foucault has developed, he writes his first book, which is Madness and Civilisation, a history of insanity in the age of reason, which I think is a wonderful subheading. So here's the book here. So in this book, he argues that he tries to challenge the modern assumption that we treat the mentally ill more humanely in our present period than we did in the past, that mentally ill people receive better treatment and are better catered for than they were in the past. And in order to link this, or to challenge this hypothesis that most people would generally believe, he looks at the 16th and 17th century, particularly the Renaissance. He then moves to the 18th century and looks at the Great Confinement. And then he moves on, he looks at the modern experiences and how confinement has continued and been accelerated by the development of modern psychology. So to begin with, we can take a look at these early Renaissance ideas or Renaissance notions of madness. And in this image that we see here, there is a doctor supported by a priest or a monk who is removing what would be referred to as the stone of madness from the brain of someone who was considered mad. So this might be well, it's called the stone of madness, but we would call it a lobotomy nowadays, wouldn't we? So they would say that whilst mentally ill people were repressed during this times, they are having kind of open brain surgery enforced on them in this early stage. Foucault also argues that whilst that is certainly more barbaric than what we would expect to see today, he also argues that during the Renaissance period, many many people who were mentally ill actually had a significant amount of freedom too. So Foucault identifies this boat called the Ship of Fools. So he argues that even though these kind of brutal lobotomies were taking place and many mad people tend to be removed from cities, they actually could still roam around. They were still free to travel from city to city, from place to place, exposing their kind of mad ideas. And he argues for many of the peasant population, when they would see someone who was mad stood in the middle of the streets preaching or yelling or acting a certain way, that many of the onlookers would appreciate this particular individual as the limits of the human psyche, as the limits to what they who they could become, or who we really are underneath. Similarly, he also uses this image of the Ship of Fools and argues that mentally ill people had a significant amount of freedom. So if you were mentally ill, in some cases you'd be gathered by the township, you'd be put onto a boat and you would be cast off to sea along with all of these other people who were considered mad. And as a result, you would either die at sea, or you would land somewhere else and you would continue your nomadic lifestyle. Now, whilst it doesn't sound particularly glamorous, Foucault is arguing that it's that increased level of freedom that was enjoyed by these people that isn't enjoyed today, that they don't enjoy today, that is particularly crucial to the period and treatment of the mentally ill. He then argues by the time we get to the 18th century and the birth of capitalism, or the early kind of beginnings of capitalism, that there is something called a great confinement for the mentally ill. those who are considered mentally ill are not allowed to roam around anymore. They're not allowed to be free. They can't walk around in the streets. They can't shout at people. They are then instead imprisoned. They are put inside institutions where they are chained, and in some cases they are treated like the Elephant Man in David Lynch's film, where they could, normal people could come in on a Sunday and they could laugh or see these people who would be considered freaks, even though they were mentally ill, in their cages and in their confined space as a result. So therefore, there's been a huge change in how we understand madness and how we treat madness. And generally, this would be seen as being more one way of dealing with it. But it's also could be argued that could be seen as being more humane than what we experienced in the previous era, such as the 16th and 17th century. If we look at this in even more detail, we can see here people being strapped to chairs and having electrotherapy as a result, as it continues throughout the 18th century into the 19th century as a result. I also like to, because obviously I present this to level 3 students, I always make the link with the Joker in Batman, where he ends up being confined. So even though Batman is, the Joker is someone who's causing a lot of problems in Gotham, particularly violent problems, so he probably wouldn't have been someone on the Ship of Fools, there is still this idea of confinement, someone who, because the Joker is quite an interesting character in the nihilism he portrays in his view of life, which can be quite philosophical and interesting. But as a result of his violent crimes, in this case, he is then confined. But if we think about it, just if he didn't commit those violent crimes, he's someone who has an interesting nihilistic viewpoint of the world and legitimate justification for his understanding of the world. He is then confined and removed as undesirable from society as a result. So Foucault then argues that what happens in the 19th century towards the 20th century as we develop is this confinement continues. So we do still confine people who are mentally ill, but instead of confining them to prison-like systems, we confine them into hospitals where it is said to be more humane, where they have been removed from society as undesirable and confined into this one space where they are to be tested on by psychiatrists and psychologists. And the psychiatrists and psychologists define what is meant by normal and what is meant by abnormal, and the patients are treated accordingly as a result. Some patients may enter these institutions and they may never leave for the rest of their life because they have been diagnosed as abnormal by this episteme system. So hopefully that makes sense. But throughout the book, what we can see is the episteme, the concept of madness, has been constantly changed and redefined throughout key historical periods. That madness initially meant, yes, you could have a lobotomy and you could have brutal kind of brain surgery committed upon you, but you also had an element of freedom. And then madness, the definition of madness changes to the need to confine people to a prison cell so that they don't cause problems in the townships. They need to be removed from society and isolated. So then the development in the 19th and 20th centuries, where these people have lost their freedom altogether, they are removed by society as undesirables and are to be tested on by psychologists and modern science and people with PhDs. There's going to be more on psychology in the next lecture, but that's kind of how he sees epistemes working. So therefore, we can't necessarily argue that we treat the mad more humanely than we used to, because what they have lost is they have lost their freedom. Whilst we're not in all cases we're delivering open brain surgery, they've certainly lost a significant amount of freedom through this process. So Foucault continues this idea throughout the rest of his work. So he does the same kind of idea through the birth of the clinic or the birth of modern medicine. He argues that instead of being seen as a person in medical discourse, you are instead seen as a set of organs and are identified by the medical gaze. In the order of things, which is an interesting one, this is where he argues that the development of the academia and various different sections of academia define discourses within their own section and within their own disciplines which then form these epistemes. So therefore academia is responsible for presenting itself as neutral and impartial when actually it has a significant influence on the bodies and the behaviours of people in society. He does the same in The Birth of the Prison, but we're going to look at that next time. And he also looks at it again in his three-part series on the history of sexuality. And he argues in the history of sexuality that sex used to be something used for pleasure, that if we look at Chinese paintings and accounts of sex in ancient societies, sex was something that would be given for pleasure. It then shifts its discourse due to the development the rise of Roman Catholicism, where through the confession, perversions are then recorded, and it then dictates what is normal sexual behavior and what is abnormal sexual behavior, what can be considered as perverted and what is not perverted, what is considered godly and what is not in terms of the realm of sex. And then he also argues in our modern period that whilst you might argue there's been a return to pleasure, he would argue that instead there's been a scientific focus on sex, that it is about reproductive organs reproducing and how to stimulate certain organs in order to produce pleasure, as opposed to the pleasure of being with someone else and genuinely living in the moment, in that sense, to give it an oversimplification. So just to finish off, so Foucault was, of course, a famous activist during his period, during his time. There's an image here where he he founded the Group for Information About Prisons, where he wanted prisoners to talk about their experiences and how they were being exploited during the prison system. We can see here he's actually got Jean-Paul Sartre in front of him, assisting him. But he argues that, or as part of this campaign, he argues that the penal system turns petty criminals into hardened criminals, that the actual penal system doesn't succeed in reforming per se, and it doesn't succeed in what it claims to be doing. Instead, it is transforming petty criminals into hardened criminals. He also became an anti-racism campaigner. He was particularly supportive of solidarity in Poland and the movements against communism in Europe too. But unfortunately, he dies in 1984 when he contracts AIDS from one of his many experiences in the bathhouse. He also is a big fan of taking things like LSD and various other drugs, which is quite interesting when you think about it. Whenever you look at any kind of people that are considered great thinkers, they always seem to be addicted to some sort of substance. With Marx, it was obviously beer. He drank a lot of beer, and with Foucault, it's drugs. So that's it for this lecture. We'll continue with The Birth of the Prison next time, probably next Thursday. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Please share if you enjoyed the video and if you enjoyed this brief synopsis. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I will see you next time.